Tēnā koto katoa and hello everybody. Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. My name is Ben Adelberg and I'm coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Tēnei ka mihi ki te mana whenua o Aotearoa. And we acknowledge the local tribal authorities of New Zealand.
And g'day, I'm Emma Strutt and I'm currently coming to you from Darrinbal country in Queensland. Before we dive into our conversation today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And finally, if you enjoy this potty, please subscribe, like, share or comment on our social media and consider buying us a coffee if you'd like to help support our work. Now on with the show.
We talk a lot about the environmental and health impacts of climate change. Yet, in 4 seasons, we have never covered the economic impacts, something that has far greater impact than we may realise.
Today, we're speaking with Professor Ilan Noy, Chair in the Economics of Disasters and Climate Change at Victoria University of Wellington. Professor Noy is also the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Economics of Disaster and Climate Change, and his research and teaching focuses on the economic aspects of natural hazards, disasters, climate change, and other related topics in environmental development. One of his recent publications assessed the global costs of extreme weather that are attributable to climate change, and we'll be giving you a rundown of that paper today. Ilan, thank you so much for joining us.
Kia ora, Ben. Kia ora, Emma. Nice to be with you.
Ilan, just to kick things off, I would love to learn a little bit about your personal background. From what I've seen, you've lived in at least 4 very diverse parts of the world. But how you came to be in this field of work?
Well, first of all, about my background, I grew up in Israel, so that's where my accent comes from. And when I grew up in Israel, I finished my undergraduate degree in Israel, my university degree in Israel, and then decided that I have to leave. And I left for the United States. I pursued a doctorate studies there in economics. And at the time, this was just after the Asian financial crisis. So I did work on financial crises. So the Asian financial crisis was 97, 98. And I just started just after that. So that I focused on that because I was in Asia during the crisis, and I realized that it was a very important event for the region. Specifically, it hit five countries: Thailand, Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And then I got, I finished my doctorate. I got a first job as a professor at the University of Hawaii. So I moved to Honolulu and started teaching there. And then we had, unfortunately, the Southeast Asian, the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. So I realized pretty quickly, maybe 2 days after the event, when everybody was glued to the televisions, because this is the first time we've ever seen tsunami on TV, and was, of course, horrific, and many people died, probably almost 250,000 people. And at the time, I sort of, I was an economist, a practicing economist, and I realized 2 things. One is that this is a very big economic event. Besides the human tragedy and all the grief and all of that, it's a huge economic shock to the affected region. In the case of Aceh in Indonesia, and also Thailand, because it hit a very heavily touristy area. So it the island of Phuket. It hit Sri Lanka again along the tourism area. So it's a very important economic event, other than other than the human tragedy. And the other thing I realized is the same tools I've sort of developed and used when I was looking at financial crisis, I can also use to look at this event. Because it's a different type of shock. So financial crisis is one type of shock. The tsunami was a different type of shock. So I started looking at disasters, sort of those disasters that are caused by natural hazards, like tsunamis, like earthquakes, like hurricanes, and so forth. Um, and I spent probably a decade doing that, looking at various economic impacts of these events. And then sometimes about maybe 10 years ago or so, I realized that these extreme weather events are also, of course, related to climate change. Um, and since then, I've been also focusing on climate change, but specifically not on a lot of other questions you can ask about climate change, but specifically on extreme weather events and how there, because climate change is changing the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, what does that imply in terms of the costs of climate change to the economy? And that's where the paper that you already mentioned, that paper is in that line of research. In the paper that you mentioned, I'm trying to be more global in it than in a lot of the other work I've done. It's much more specific to a specific circumstance or a specific event, and we can maybe talk about that in detail. Yeah, that's basically my life story. In between, I had, married, had 3 kids, and so forth, and did a lot of other things. But that's basically my life story.
So, what brought you to New Zealand? Is the Australasian region just a hotbed for good research? We give you
Um,
good fires, we give you lots of flooding, we give you earthquake risks, volcano risk. I mean, it's a good place to research.
so Aotearoa is definitely a good place if you're interested in natural hazards. And sort of why did I started my sort of tour around the globe, going from Israel west, and I went to California, and then went to Hawaii and in New Zealand, and sort of just moving west. But it's a mixture of personal reasons that brought me to Aotearoa. Quality of life is an obvious motivation to come to New Zealand. And also, I came just after the Christchurch earthquake. So at the time of the Christchurch earthquake, which was a very big event for New Zealand, by far the biggest disaster in New Zealand history, um, in terms of um, in terms of the economic impact of that event. And so there was interest here in New Zealand to fund this position that I'm in now, which is this chair in the economics of disasters and climate change. Originally it was called just a chair in economics of disasters, and it was funded by the New Zealand government pretty much soon after the Christchurch earthquake, and sort of I was hired um, in that position for that position, and that's when I came to Wellington with my family.
So tell us more about that research group and the kinds of work that you're doing there.
Yeah, so I'm leading a research group that is about fluctuates in size, but it's about 10 people. Um, and we are working on the economics of disasters and climate change. And I'm kind of boring. That's all my life. It's this topic. But it could be a very very wide, diverse list of topics that are related to this, because when we're talking about economic impacts, we can think of, the grand macroeconomic impacts on GDP in a country hit by a specific event. But we can also think at the micro level on households and what happens to them when they're hit by an extreme event, and what happens to their decisions about consumption, what happens to their decisions about investment in education or in health, what are the long-term consequences for their well-being because of this, what is the implications for prices and trade, and what is the implication of these the consequences of those events in sort of at every level, from the macro to the very micro, and for a wide diversity of relevant impacts. You can also look at it not just in terms of consequences, but also in terms of how do you mitigate, how do you prevent, where should you be preventing when one of the basic tenets of economics is we live in a world in which there are not an infinite amount of resources. So when we don't have an infinite amount of resources, we need to prioritize, for example. So, for example, I have a project on looks at at Whanganui-a-Ta'a in Wellington, and looks at, we have a whole long list of buildings that are potentially risky for earthquakes, and we need to decide, okay, how do we prioritize which buildings will we do first? We retrofit first, because we can't do all 200 office buildings in the city at the same time. We need to decide on prioritization. That prioritization has to do with the risk to human mortality, but also with the economic role of the building, the cost of the retrofitting, how difficult it is, how quickly you can do it. So there's a whole list of, it's just an example of another type of work. So there could be a very large diverse, and I have a student who is looking at the impact of marine heat waves on fisheries, okay, on fisheries production in New Zealand, or on the impact of tropical cyclone on fisheries in the Philippines, right? So very large set of potential topics, but all of them have to do with the economics of disasters and climate change.
And in 2017, you also co-founded a new scientific journal of the same name. So what was the driving force behind establishing that?
The main driving force there was that my colleagues, the economics profession, was, I felt, ignoring this issue. So I felt that maybe two things they are ignoring. Disasters are a very big development issue, because many low-income and low-middle-income countries are facing a lot of impact from disasters, and that is a main obstacle for them to develop and obtain, better standards of living, better health, better education, and so on and so forth. Maybe a sort of an example for that. In 2015, Vanuatu was hit by tropical cyclone Pam, which was a very big event for Vanuatu. It hit the capital city and so forth. And the president at the time, or his prime minister, I'm sorry, I forget if it's in Vanuatu, it's prime minister or president, but he said that this event sort of put Vanuatu 10 years back in terms of its development, right? So my profession, economics, was ignoring the importance of these disasters as a main issue for development economics. Okay, and I was doing all this work on these events in the various developing countries that I was investigating, a lot of in Southeast Asia, some in Latin America, and I didn't feel that I was getting the attention that this issue was getting the attention it deserved. Not that I personally, but that the issue didn't get the attention it deserved in development economics. I also felt, and to some extent I still feel, that the economics profession is not focused enough on climate change. That has changed a bit, or changed quite a lot in the last 2 years, but only in the last 2 years. So up to 2 years ago, the issue of climate change mostly did not exist in economics, except for one issue, and that may be something you've already talked about in your podcast, and that is the possibly what most economists say the best way to deal with climate change is to put some price on carbon. So tax carbon, or do an emission trading scheme of some sort, and that's the best way to deal with it from an economic perspective. And that's it. That was the extent of what economists have been doing on climate change. And I thought, and I still think, that there is a lot more that needs to be done, and there's no journal in economics that focuses on this topic as a signal that this is an important topic. So that's basically the motivation. The motivation was, there is no journal that highlights this those two topics, the disasters and climate change, as topics that are worthy of specific attention from the economic profession. So I want to create a journal that does highlight the need to do this work on these issues. And then I basically approached the two main publishers for academic journals, which is Elsevier and Springer, and got an approval from them. They went through an assessment. Is this a real topic? Yes, they concluded climate change is a real topic, and actually there is public interest in the topic, and then we started this journal. Yeah.
Now, you say the name of your research group initially was Economics of Disasters and then later changed to include climate change.
Yeah.
At what point did that change? Was that a self realization that, you know what, there's a link? Or is it just because, we're getting to a point now where it's important, so maybe we should?
I woke up and realized, okay, climate change. I mean, I knew about climate change before that, of course, but it wasn't an issue that I was specifically focused on. Because most of it was about carbon trading and carbon prices and how do you reduce emissions. And I wasn't working on that topic. And when I realized that this is also linked to extreme events, to disasters, that's when I said, okay, I need to work on climate change as well, because my sort of professional knowledge and my toolbox and so forth are also relevant to this issue of climate change. And then we added the name to the chair and started the journal with the same name, and so on and so forth.
So let's talk about your recent paper then, the global cost of extreme weather that are attributable to climate change. Firstly, maybe let's just set the scene a little as to why the need for this paper. So could you maybe talk us through the main ways of assessing the cost of climate change currently used in the literature, what the potential deficiencies are, and the approach that you used in this paper instead?
Yeah, so the main, or probably almost the only way to assess the costs of climate change, up to this, at least this strand of work, has been to do what we call integrated assessment models. So the integrated assessment models are basically a model of the climate, a model of the economy, and the two are integrated together. The two are linked together with a pretty basic equation that says, if there is the change in the global average temperature is, say, 0.5 degree or 1 degree, then that translates to a certain impact on the global economy. Okay, that's the most simple link. Sometimes the links are a bit more nuanced. So, if there's a 1 degree change in the global average temperature, then that translates to this amount of change, this amount of cost in this sector, and this amount of cost in this sector. But it's a pretty basic setup. And what that setup ignores is extreme events, because it looks at the change in the global average temperature. Okay. And it ignores extreme events. It ignores a lot of other things, by the way. It ignores mortality, it ignores environmental impacts, it ignores sort of cultural impacts on cultural assets and all kinds of other things. But it also ignores extreme weather events, which is the topic that I'm sort of interested in. So that sort of motivated us, and I'm part of a group of people who work in this space, is to use a tool that climate scientists have been developing to look at the role of climate change in extreme weather events, to say something about the economic impacts. So sort of you can think about it as the standard method is a top-down. Let's model the economy and the climate and do some reduced form assessment of the costs, or a sort of a bottom up. Let's look at specific events. Let's look at the role of climate change in those events, and then quantify, therefore, what is the cost of climate change, at least in terms of changing the probability and intensity of extreme weather events. So that has been my approach. Sort of caveat here, I'm only trying to quantify what is the role of climate change through extreme weather events. There's a lot of other things that climate change is doing that I'm not quantifying. So, for example, sea level rise, the slow rising of the seas that causes, salinization of various agricultural land and potentially, floods various areas, in some cases, vast areas, or, ocean acidification. So all these slow-moving processes that I'm not quantifying at all, and they are costly. Okay, and we are just quantifying the cost of extreme the climate change part of extreme weather events.
Can we take just a quick step back and just define economic impact? Are we talking about the cost to repair or adapt? Are we talking about the loss of, as you've mentioned, productivity or growth and so on? Define what economic impact actually means.
Okay, so in each paper or in each project that I'm doing, I'm potentially defining that term. I'm looking at the subset of the economic impacts and clearly defined, right? So in the paper that you mentioned, at the global paper that we can talk about later, I'm quantifying the value of damages, the monetary value of damages, and also the monetary value of mortality. And we can talk about that as a and how I do that and so forth, and what's the is that a problematic attempt or not? But there are a lot of other economic impacts that we are not quantifying. So, for example, you can think of it not as the value of damages, but the cost of reconstruction. When you have damages, that's potentially a different value than the value of what was damaged, right? You can talk about other types of economic impacts, like harm to income, reduced income, reduced ability to spend on human capital. I have another project that looks at human capital. Human capital is sort of the way economists call health and education, basically. So what is the harm from climate change to health, and what is the harm to education? As these are the sort of the main two inputs in how productive we can be. That's why we call it human capital, right? So the more educated we are and the healthier we are, the more productive we can be. And that's why, so that's also something. We can look at health and we can look at education. And of course, these things have very long-term impact. So if there's harm to health or education, that potentially has a lifelong impact on your productivity, and potentially not only to your productivity, but also to your children and your grandchildren, because these things get transferred through the generations. But that's so potentially we can even look at that as an economic impact. So the fact that, for example, from extreme weather events, some people get reduced access to education, and because of that, they're less educated, would potentially mean that their children will be less educated, because we know that by far the most important determinant of education is how much education your parents had, right? If you have more educated parents, you're much more likely to have more education. So, you can see that translate through generations and potentially have very, very long-term economic impact. So what we call economic impact can be a very large diversity of variables that we can analyze and we can trace and we can quantify. I should add that the main value of quantification is because we need to develop policies. Okay, we're not just doing this work because we are curious and we are just find it interesting, but because we want to understand what is how much should we prioritize this issue, right? The world is dealing with a lot of problems, right? Climate change is just one of them. So we need to understand what is the magnitude of this problem so that we can decide, should we prioritize this over other problems, okay? Or how much resources should we, direct to that problem rather than a lot of other problems that we have. We have child poverty, child malnutrition. That's a very urgent problem, right? And on the other hand, we can think of other problems that we have that may be less urgent or less important or less big than climate change. And that's why I think that those quantifications are useful and important, and why I'm pursuing them.
And I mean, obviously, extreme weather events have the significant costs associated with them. No one's arguing that these events aren't part of the natural kind of climatic system, but they are increasing in frequency and intensity, and that's thanks to what we're doing. That means the reported disaster losses are going to be increasing too, and whether or not that does bump it up to, number one, number two concern, that's debatable. But what kind of increases are we actually talking about here?
Yes. So let me just reframe it a little bit. So disasters are, the impact of disasters is a function of the hazard, so these extreme weather phenomena, but they are also a function of our exposure to them and our vulnerability to them, right? So in some places, for example, I live in Whanganui Atara in Wellington, 100 km/h wind is not really a disaster here because we get that on almost a daily basis. So everything is sort of tied down. So when you have 100 km/h wind gusts, nothing really gets destroyed. But in a lot of other places around the world, 100 km/h wind will cause massive amount of destruction because they're not built to withstand that kind of wind, right? Because they don't have that on a regular basis. So there's a lot of importance in terms of disaster impact, also of exposure and vulnerability, rather than just the hazard itself. So we know that the hazard is becoming more intense or more frequent. These are just two sides of the same coin. It's not really a different either or, it's just looking at it a bit differently, right? So we know these events are becoming more frequent or more intense. That does not necessarily mean that we will have more impacts. If we manage to reduce vulnerability and exposure, then we potentially have, but then we need to invest in reducing exposure, for example, moving away from dangerous areas, or reducing vulnerability by building roofs that won't blow away in 100 km/h winds, right? So I'm just sort of being a bit cautious here about, it's not necessarily that the impacts are going to be and be higher. In practice, they are, because we're not doing enough to reduce exposure and vulnerability for various other reasons. And I've done some work on that, for example, or work on managed retreat. Why are we not reducing exposure by moving away from harmful location? That's the term, managed retreat in the climate space. So what we are doing here, so as you said, extreme weather events have always happened. There's nothing new about storms and floods, and ancient China had a lot of floods, and ancient Israel had droughts. The 7 lean years and the 7 rich years, and the story of Moses and not Moses, Joseph. These events have always happened, but we know from the science, and this is where I can use what the climate scientists are telling me, is we know we can now quantify for specific weather events or specific types of weather events, how much those events are changing in terms of the frequency or the intensity, right? And this is what we call attribution. We attribute, for a specific event, we attribute either the changing probability of the event. So take, I don't know, wildfires take the flood, take the tropical cyclone we had the ex-tropical cyclone we had here in Aotearoa, Gabrielle, earlier this year in 2023, which was a hugely destructive event, by far the most damaging extreme weather event in at least 50 years. And that we can talk about either that event becoming more likely because of climate change, and we can quantify by how much that event became more likely, or we can talk about the intensity, so how much that event became more intense because of climate change. So sort of you're thinking about two different thought experiments on, how much that event would have been less intense if there was no climate change. So if we didn't have these all that greenhouse gases that we spewed into the atmosphere in the last 150 years. That event would have been either less likely, just wouldn't, less probability that it would have happened, or it would have been less intense. So it's two ways of basically asking the same question, which is how did climate change the parameters of that extratropical cyclone Gabrielle? Okay, so this is attribution work, and this is what I'm building on when I'm doing the economic analysis.
So, in regards to, like, I'm just pulling up your paper now, and the comment where the World Meteorological Association reported a 7-fold increase in reported disaster losses from extreme weather since 1970s. How much of that is associated, do you think, with actual anthropogenic climate change, or is it just a difference in reporting methodology, or what do you think is contributing to that?
It's all of the above. It's
All of the above.
in reporting. It's a change in exposure. So a lot more people are moving to coasts and things like in places like that are much more exposed to extreme weather events. Some changes in vulnerability. So some areas are becoming more vulnerable. So some cities, because the safest areas have already been settled, so they're now settling the more risky areas. So vulnerability in some cities is increasing. And it's climate change. Okay, of that reported 7-fold increase that the World Meteorological Organization is quoting, how much is each one of them? I don't really know, and that's not something we have the ability to know at this point in time. But we sort of take a different tack, and that is we look at specific types and classes of economic events, and we're trying to describe in the last 20 years what do we know about the changing likelihood of these events, and therefore, if, for example, an event, a type of event, let's say a hurricane in the Caribbean, becomes 20% more likely. So we can argue that 20% of the damages from hurricanes in the last 20 years are because of climate change. Or you could put it differently, 20% of the hurricanes that occurred in the last 20 years are because of climate change. And 80% would have happened anyway. Okay. And then we can start to quantify, okay, if 20% of the hurricanes that happen are because of climate change, what was the cost for these hurricanes? And then we collect the data on what was the damage from those hurricanes, both in terms of the damage to assets, to buildings, to roads, to electricity systems, and so forth, and mortality. And then we can quantify, okay, that's the cost for hurricanes in the Caribbean. We can similarly do it for flooding in Europe, or droughts in Australia, or wherever. Right? So that's basically what we do in that paper. We understand what is the changing likelihood of those events. We understand what the cost of those events are, and then we basically combine the two pieces of information to understand what is the cost of those events in the last 20 years. We can't identify a trend here because we only have 20 years of data. And it's just a few events in each location or each type of event. So you can't really, from 2 events or 3 events, you don't really know if there is a trend here. Okay, so we're not trying to identify a trend. We're trying to identify the share of the events that is associated with climate change. One thing that I didn't really define is what I mean by climate change. By climate change, I mean the change in the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that occurred as a result of anthropogenic activities, so human activity in the past 150 years. And actually, it's the past 150 years, but most of it is in the past 30, 40 years. Right? By far, most of the greenhouse gases that we have added into the atmosphere it's not our grandparents who have done that. It's us. I mean, I'm 53, so I'm to blame as much as anyone. And it is these 50 years in which by far most of the greenhouse gases have been emitted into the atmosphere. So that's my definition of climate change. It's the impact of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So it's anthropogenic climate change. It's not other changes in the climate that have nothing to do with our activity.
You mentioned earlier started talking a little bit about the attributed costs for such events. Let's dig a little bit deeper. And you spoke about value of life. How does one put a price or a cost?
Let me first argue that it's important to look at mortality. Okay, that mortality is important, and we care about people dying, and that's why I want to quantify it. Not because I sort of discount it and I want to attach a dollar value, but actually because I think it's important. I think it's important to quantify it. Okay, and now in terms of the approach, it's the same approach that we have, that I've already sort of suggested. It's if say 20% of the hurricanes in the Caribbean, the probability of a hurricane occurring in the Caribbean is 20% more likely. So 20% of the probability is because of climate change. Then we can measure the damages, the damages to assets from hurricanes in the Caribbean in the past 20 years, and 20% of that is because of climate change. And similarly, mortality. So say 1,000 people died because of hurricanes in the Caribbean. I don't remember the actual number, but let's say it's 1,000. Then 20% of that is because of climate change. Okay, so that's that's 200 people. Okay, so I can say 200 people and $2 million of damages, right? And just keep the two separate. Okay, so that may be useful, but I think there is something useful about trying to aggregate everything into a metric that will allow us to say this event is more important than that event. Okay, so when you are trying to aggregate something that is measured in dollars and something that is measured in human lives, there are basically two ways you can do it. Either measure everything in dollars to convert the mortality into dollars, or you can convert the dollar value into measurements of human lives. Okay, and in different works I've done either one of those things. I doubt it will be interesting to get into more deeply of why you would prefer one to the other. The standard way that most economists do is convert mortality to dollar value. Okay, that I know that sounds a bit heartless. I acknowledge that, but it is something that is implicit in all government policy everywhere and around the world. Okay, so governments ultimately have to decide how to spend their money, right? So to give you an example, they need to decide whether they should widen a road to make it more safe. Okay, so in principle, if for every road in the city you have it 5 lanes each side and allow every car to only go there at 10 kilometers an hour, no one would ever die of traffic accidents, right? But we don't do that. We don't do that because would be very, very, very costly to do, right? So ultimately, there is an implicit trade-off there between saving human lives and the cost of preventing those deaths, right? So governments all the time do these implicit calculations about, okay, we can do this policy and that will save a number of lives. Is that worthwhile investment or not, right? So every government has these decisions on how much a human life is valued. Okay, Australian government, the New Zealand government has it. In New Zealand, it's $5 million. I'm not sure what Australia has. But our Ministry of Transport uses, I think it's $5.2 million or something like New Zealand dollars. Okay, so it's implicit in a lot of decisions that we put a dollar value on human life. So I'm not doing something that is unusual. It's just usually something that people don't like to talk about. So governments definitely don't typically. So you don't hear a politician saying, hey, we value a human life as 5 million and this will save your life, but it will cost us 6 million, so we're not doing it. Right? We never hear anyone saying that, but implicitly they are doing that all the time. Policymakers do that all the time. So what I'm doing is I'm taking that 200 people who died in the Caribbean because of climate change, to go back to my example, and I'm attaching a dollar value to that. And which dollar value? Well, I just sort of almost randomly took the average of what the US government uses and what the UK government does. Okay. Oddly, the life of American is worth a lot more than the life of a Brit. So the UK government uses, I think, I don't remember exactly the number, it's in the paper, but it's 2 point something million pounds. And the US government uses about 10 million US dollars. Why the difference? I don't know. They have different policy frameworks and they've reached different conclusions about things. So I just use the average of the two, which amounts to about 7 million US dollars. And that's the number we use, and that's the number we use globally. So every single person around the world who died in those extreme weather events because of climate change, we multiply that mortality by $7 million. You can say that, well, actually 7 million is too much or too little or whatever. And the point is we use the same number for everyone around the world. So, mortality is equally horrendous from this perspective in anywhere around the world. And at least from an ethical point of view, I think that's an acceptable assumption. Whether it's 7 million or 5 million or should be 6.5 million, I don't really know. And if someone is uncomfortable with the number, we put all the data online, they can use their own number. But the point we do argue in the paper is that mortality is actually a very big issue in terms of the overall cost. So when you compare the mortality cost to the damage costs, mortality is actually very, very important. And that's something that's not usually understood. We need to also understand that a lot of the damages happen in high-income countries, and a lot of the mortality happens in low-income countries. Okay, so once you start adding those two together, you understand that a lot of the problem is in the low-income countries, where there isn't much assets, and therefore the damage to assets from these extreme weather events is not very high, right? But there's a lot of mortality caused by these events. And once you sort of multiply that by the $7 million sort of price tag that we use, and it's radio, so the air quotes are not really captured, but I don't really mean it cynically as a price tag, right? Over that, but that's the number, the value we use. Once you multiply the amount of mortality that is happening in low-income countries because of climate change, and you multiply it by $7 million, you understand that this is actually a very, very big issue from a global perspective.
To quote the figures from your paper, you state 143 billion US dollars per year of the cost of extreme events is attributable to climate change, of which the majority, 63% of this is due to human lost life. So it's just to elaborate on your point, how significant that is. 63% of the 143 US billion dollars is attributed to human loss. So the figure that you've put, that just really highlights how significant that is.
Yeah, so it highlights the significance of mortality. It also highlights the significance of the impact of extreme weather events because of climate change, because $143 billion is a very large sum of money. And I think the best way to think about that is that really a big, yes, it has a lot of zeros, but that usually for most people, it has 9 zeros in it. Does that really matter if it has 10 zeros or 8 zeros or so on? So we need to compare it to some magnitude that we can sort of relate to. And I think that my best comparison to that is to how much we have agreed in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, how much we have agreed to spend on this issue. So basically, when we're talking about spending on the climate change problem, we're talking about three things. We're talking about mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, right? Well, how much have we agreed to spend on loss and damage? Up to now, nothing. Next year we have a COP, a conference of the big global meeting for climate change, and in that COP we may, if we're lucky, get some start of a loss and damage fund. But the other two issues we are spending on is mitigation and adaptation, right? And in that space, in that mitigation and adaptation, we have agreed to spend. That's in the Paris Agreement from 2015. We have agreed to spend $100 billion a year, right? And that $100 billion a year, that was the agreement. We have never produced that amount of money. Okay, till today, there hasn't been $100 billion available for mitigation and adaptation. Roughly 90% has been spent from whatever money there was, and never 100 billion, but let's ignore that. Let's assume there was 100 billion, because that was the agreement. Just countries who promised didn't quite cough up the amount that they promised. From that, about 90% was spent on mitigation, about 10% was spent on adaptation. So in principle, we've promised the world to spend about $10 billion on adaptation to fix a problem that costs us already $143 billion a year. Okay? So the size of the problem is way bigger than the size of the tool we are trying to use to deal with it. And that to me suggests that we are sort of underestimating the cost of climate change, and we're underestimating the need to spend resources and do something about it. Okay, so in my view, $143 billion is a lot of money. Is way, and we also compare that to what, if we go back to our earlier discussion about integrated assessment models, it's significantly more than what the integrated assessment models are assessing as the current cost of climate change. And in the paper, we do some comparisons, and we show that that number, $143 billion, is way more than the most well-known integrated assessment model that is used. Yeah.
So, Ilan, this question links to a different paper you've published previously about economists' involvement in the IPCC. And considering there is such a difference between what you're estimating and what we're actually spending here, I'd like to get your opinion on economists' involvement in the IPCC reports, because obviously they provide important material for governments to draw on, base their policies around, at least in theory. But do you think that economists are engaged enough with the IPCC reports and the working groups? And if not, what would the benefits be of increasing their representation?
No, they are not engaged enough. And this already, I already mentioned that when I was talking about the journal and why I started this journal. I think most economists sort of ignored this problem for a long time. And that has only changed in the last 2 years. Probably it's as I think sort of oddly enough as a consequence of COVID. So most economists, once the COVID pandemic started, sort of redirected their efforts into looking at the COVID problem, because again, it was a problem that sort of economists have ignored completely. Pandemic as a risk has been ignored by the economic profession up to 2020. And then they did many economists did some work on the pandemics, on the pandemic risk in those sort of 2 years of the main 2 years of the pandemic. Of course, it's still ongoing, but the main 2 years of the pandemic, 2020 and 2021. And then they realized actually there are other problems in the world that we need to be thinking about, and one of them, obvious one, is climate change. So a lot of economists have very recently started to be interested in this issue of climate change. So no, economists are not they're not heavily involved in the IPCC. And if you look at the list of IPCC authors and so on, and which is what we do in that paper, we show that not only there's not much involvement, it's also they're less involved now than they used to be maybe 15 years ago. Largely because 15 years ago they had one message, and that one message was, and I mentioned that already, we need to tax carbon either through a direct tax or through an emission trading scheme, and then we will solve the climate problem. So it's a very simple proposition. It's, to some extent, it's very true also, if we could get that thing moving, but we haven't. And then, most economists thought, okay, from an economic perspective, I solved the climate problem. All we need to do is a tax, and I'm going on to my research on, I don't know, cricket. And I think it's only recently people started to realize, okay, this is actually not the case. I mean, we haven't solved the problem. We have a suggested tool. Nobody's using it, or hardly anyone is using it. So even in countries we have been using it for a long time, like in New Zealand, we have had an emission trading scheme for quite a while. But throughout most of that period, the price has been so abysmally low that it didn't make any impact. So our estimate is that the price should probably be, north of $100 a ton to have any significant impact on emissions. But when it's $5 a ton, then it's not making any kind of impact. And that's been throughout most of the time that this system has been in place in New Zealand. So economists have only recently became more interested. I discuss in the paper a lot of other reasons that have to do with the methodology that economists use and so forth, that also prevent them from being more deeply engaged in this topic. But there is also, like anything like every economist, I also think about demand and supply, right? So it's both the supply of economists interested in the topic that is an issue, but also the demand from the IPCC. So there's been some issues in the past with clash of personalities between some economists and other IPCC authors that made a lot of the people who are central to the IPCC to be very suspicious of economists. And therefore, sort of, there is both a demand and supply issue, but I largely blame my profession, economics, as not engaging enough with this, in my view, a very, very important issue that we could address and we should address. We could, this is a fixable issue, climate change. I come from Israel. I'm aware that some issues are not fixable, but this one is, and we just haven't fixed it completely. So we've failed miserably. We've known about this problem. The first paper that looked at the greenhouse problem was published, 130 years ago. So we've had plenty of advance notice, a lot of advance notice about this, and we haven't done much. So we need to get our act together, and part of that quantification is to say, yes, this is a real issue. It's a real issue, not in the future. So this $143 billion number that I identify, I analyze, is now. It's not 20 years from now or 50 years from now. By 2100, we will be paying $143 billion a year. It's in the past 20 years. On average, every year we paid $143 billion because of this failure. What it will be in the future, it will be more. It won't be less, it will be much more, because the changing probability and intensity of extreme weather events is just becoming more and more, So, yeah.
This conversation has been absolutely fascinating and really sort of opened our eyes to the economic impacts. It's something we've never really taken into consideration. The value placed on life makes it easier to quantify. You put a figure out. Wow, that's a big figure. It just brings this additional layer of reality. For, say, in an ideal world, the next round of IPCC reports, we've got a lot of PhD students and other scientists and academics that listen to this podcast and so on. What would your message be to bring the economic component more into play when reporting and communicating science?
First of all, I don't. The next IPCC report is like 8 years away, so I'm thinking about the COP next week, the big global meeting next week, rather than 8 years away. How can I change the dial 8 years from now? I'm
Yeah.
not interested in that. I want to change the dial next week.
Mm.
In the discussions in the COP in the United Arab Emirates, right? So next week, delegates from all over the world, including from Aotearoa, from Australia, from everywhere, are going to sort of arrive at in Dubai, and they're going to discuss, for example, the loss and damage fund, right? So this is this fund that we decided on, we meaning the world decided on last year in the Glasgow meeting, and we now need to flesh out many things about that fund, how it will be structured, how it will be distributing its resources, and specifically how much money it needs. So this is something that this kind of quantification, I think, allows us to say, okay, this is how much money is needed in this loss and damage fund, and also allows us to say who should receive this money. Um, Largely, it's those developing or low-income countries who are experiencing high mortality because of these extreme events. Not only them, because there's a lot of other impacts in a lot of other places, but if I had to prioritize, because we live in a world in which there are no infinite resources, and while I hope that the loss and damage fund will have $143 billion a year, I think a much more realistic number is much, much lower than that, because I don't see the world, contributing that amount of resources. So where we should prioritize is in low income countries. We should prioritize it in small island developing states, because when you compare these numbers in small island developing states relative to their size of the economy, so their ability to withstand that loss, right? Then you see that it's a much bigger problem for the Vanuatus of the world than it is to even the Pakistans of the world, right? So and definitely much much bigger than comparing to Australia or Germany or Aotearoa. So where I should prioritize is I should prioritize in the small island developing states. So that's that group of countries that involves, includes most of our neighbors in the actually all of our neighbors in the Pacific, right? But other places as well, places like the island Maldives in the Indian Ocean, places in the South Atlantic, Caribbean, and so forth. So this kind of research allows us to say, this is where we need to go, and that's what the economic profession can contribute. So economics is all about trade-offs and prioritizing and incentivizing, and sort of these are sort of very important concepts in economics. These are really important concepts in the context of dealing with the consequences of climate change. So that's where I'm focusing on, rather than thinking, okay, what should we be doing in the next IPCC? To be quite honest, I think that the IPCC has mostly achieved what it set out to do, and that is to put climate change on the global agenda. So whether we actually need another assessment report 8 years from now about climate change, I hope we won't, I hope actually we won't, because we will get our act together and then we won't need this IPCC. So in a sense, the IPCC assessment reports are a sign that we are failing. And therefore, yeah, I hope that I will never have to write again on, trying to argue that economists need to do more in the IPCC.
Professor Ilan Noi, thank you so much for this wealth of insight and knowledge, and it's been truly enlightening for us. And we really hope that if any of our listeners here have that ability to really bring about more impactful change, who knows, maybe someone listening to this podcast will be at COP Dubai next week or this week as this episode is being published. So thank you so much for sharing and so much real useful information, and we really appreciate your time. So thank you so much.
Kia ora, Ben, Emma, thank you very much. Toda rabba. And yeah, good luck. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.